Hey everyone, tonight we're going to dive into a mystery that lies in one of the driest places on Earth, a desert that seems, at first glance, to hold nothing at all. Imagine standing in southern Peru on the Nazca Plain. The land stretches out endlessly, a barren plateau where the sun scorches by day and the winds sweep across dust and stone. To the eye of someone standing there on the ground, it looks empty, almost desolate. Nothing about it suggests secrets, and yet, hidden across this landscape is something extraordinary. Lines and figures that only reveal themselves when you rise above it, as if the earth itself was meant to be read from the sky. The story of their discovery begins not with satellites or high-tech drones, but with chance glimpses by people who happened to look down from above. In the early 20th century, as aviation was just taking hold, pilots flying over the Nazca region noticed something odd etched into the desert surface. Long, straight markings crisscrossed the land, far too precise to be random. Some curved into strange shapes, others stretched in parallel, and a few hinted at something even stranger. Outlines of animals, spirals, trapezoids, and forms that seemed deliberate. Before we continue, here's a thought. If you were one of those first pilots, looking down and seeing these vast shapes for the very first time, what would you have thought they were? Let me know in the comments, and would you lean toward roads, art, or maybe even something meant for the heavens? At first, few believed what they were seeing. On the ground, these markings don't look like much at all. They appear as shallow grooves, as if someone had scraped away the top layer of dark stones to reveal the lighter soil beneath. Walking among them, you wouldn't know you were standing on the wing of a hummingbird or the tail of a monkey. They only come together when viewed from above. And so for centuries, the local people lived alongside these enormous creations without realizing the full scale of what they were. Reports began to surface in the 1920s and 30s. Some archaeologists in Peru heard about the markings, but the prevailing opinion was that they were nothing remarkable. A few scholars dismissed them as remnants of old roads, pathways carved by ancient peoples moving between settlements. Others speculated they were irrigation channels, practical works for channeling rare desert water. After all, why would anyone carve something into the earth that could only be seen from the air in a time before flight existed? To most researchers, it seemed unlikely that they were anything but utilitarian. But then came the photographs. Small aircraft flying over the Nazca Plain began to capture images of the lines from above. Suddenly, the shapes leapt into clarity. There were animals hundreds of feet across, a spider stretched with perfect symmetry, a monkey with its spiral tail curling across the desert floor, a hummingbird whose wingspan seemed almost to take flight. There were straight lines running for miles, so precise they looked as though measured by modern surveying tools. Spirals, trapezoids, even humanoid figures, some so large that a person could walk their entire life across them and never recognize what they were part of. It's hard to imagine the astonishment of those first observers. The desert, which had seemed barren, was suddenly revealed as a vast canvas, covered in gigantic artwork invisible from the ground. It was as if a message had been written to an audience in the sky, waiting thousands of years for someone to look down and finally read it. And with that realization came questions. Who had made these enormous designs? How long ago had they been carved into the earth? And most puzzling of all, why? Were they roads after all, or symbols, or something else entirely? The earliest researchers could not agree. Some clung to practical explanations, irrigation, ancient highways, or routes between ceremonial centers. Others began to wonder if something deeper was at play. The sheer size of the figures seemed to demand a purpose beyond the ordinary. If you can't see them from the ground, then who were they meant for? That question, who was supposed to see this, has lingered ever since. It has shaped every interpretation, every theory, and every imaginative leap about the Nazca Lines. From the very beginning, the mystery of visibility stood at the center, art that only makes sense from above in a world where flight was impossible. In the 1930s, the first systematic studies began. Peruvian archaeologists and visiting scholars walked the desert, mapping what they could. They were stunned by how vast the network was. It wasn't just a few lines or isolated shapes. It was hundreds of figures spread over nearly 400 square miles. The desert was crisscrossed with geometry on a scale so massive it defied easy understanding, and the more they looked, the stranger it seemed. Imagine tracing those lines on foot with the sun burning overhead. You follow one groove, only to realize it continues beyond the horizon. You step onto a trapezoid, but the angle only makes sense from above. To the walker, it's just a cleared path through stones. To the flyer, it's a message written across the earth. The difference in perspective is almost unsettling. By the middle of the 20th century, the Nazca Lines were no longer just a regional curiosity. They were becoming a global mystery. Newspapers picked up the story. Photographs circulated showing animals and shapes so large they rivaled the scale of Egypt's pyramids or England's ancient earthworks. The world's imagination was caught by the idea of a people, long vanished, who had drawn messages so vast they could only be seen from the sky. And yet, the people themselves, the Nazca culture, remained mostly silent in the archaeological record. Their cities were modest, their technology was simple. They left behind pottery, textiles, and traces of daily life, but nothing that clearly explained why they had turned their desert into such a vast open-air gallery. The lines seemed out of proportion with everything else they had left behind, like a whisper of another world layered over the ordinary traces of human settlement. That tension, between the ordinary and the extraordinary, is what makes the Nazca Lines such a compelling enigma. From the very first reports, they have resisted easy answers. Every explanation seems too small for their scale. Were they roads? If so, why shape them like a hummingbird? Were they irrigation? Then why extend them into animals and spirals? Were they art, or offerings, or something else entirely? The more we learn, the more the mystery deepens. And that's how the Nazca Lines first entered the Western imagination. Not as a solved puzzle, but as a haunting question. A barren desert, seemingly empty, revealed under the eye of flight to be full of messages whose meaning is still debated today. It's worth pausing on that thought. For thousands of years, these lines lay unnoticed, their full forms invisible to anyone on the ground. They waited, patient in the desert, until human beings invented airplanes and finally looked down. It almost feels as though the lines were made for an audience far in the future, for eyes that could only exist once humanity learned to fly. And that is where the mystery begins, in the gap between what is visible from the ground and what is only revealed from above. In that space, the questions unfold. Who drew them? What were they hoping to say? And who, or what, did they think was listening? When we speak of the Nazca Lines, it's easy to picture them floating in isolation, as if they were the only trace left behind by a vanished culture. But that's not true. Beneath those great designs lies the memory of a people who lived, struggled, and adapted in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. To understand the lines, we have to step into their world, into the Nazca culture itself. The Nazca people flourished between about 200 years before Christ and 600 years after, a span of nearly 8 centuries. They lived in the valleys carved by rivers that cut through the desert plain. Imagine green ribbons of life winding through otherwise barren land. Places where maize could grow, where cotton could be spun into thread, where fruit trees could survive. Around those rivers, the Nazca built villages and ceremonial centres, their homes clustered close to the only water available. But water was always scarce. Rain hardly ever falls on the Nazca Plain. In some parts, you could wait years without a drop. The rivers depended on snowmelt from the Andes, and when those rivers ran low, the Nazca faced drought and hunger. This challenge shaped everything about their culture. It forced them to become engineers of survival. One of the most remarkable traces they left is something called the puquios. These were underground aqueducts, spiral-shaped wells that reached down into natural aquifers. From above, a puquio looks like a corkscrew carved into the earth, spiraling deeper and deeper. You can still walk down some of them today, following the stones as they twist into the ground. Once inside, you hear the rush of water carried through tunnels, flowing out to irrigate fields. These systems were so well built that some are still in use after nearly 2,000 years. Think about that. A culture often described as primitive created waterworks that endure to this day, defying the desert. The puquios remind us that the Nazca were not helpless dreamers, etching figures into the sand. They were problem solvers, people who combined practicality with ritual, survival with imagination. Their daily life carried the mark of that duality. On one hand, they were farmers and artisans. They grew maize, beans and squash. They cultivated cotton, which they spun into brightly coloured textiles. Their weavings were so intricate that they still astonish museum visitors. Patterns of hummingbirds, serpents, and abstract motifs woven in vivid reds and blues. They made pottery unlike anything else in the ancient Andes. Bowls and jars painted with mythic scenes, their figures dancing, fighting, or merging with animals. These images give us glimpses of how they saw the world. Not a separation of human and spirit, but a continuum where shamans could transform into animals and gods could walk among mortals. On the other hand, they lived under constant pressure from the desert's harshness. Imagine a society where one failed harvest could mean disaster, where every year depended on rivers that might or might not flow. Their rituals often centered on fertility and water, praying for rain that might never come. Archaeologists have found traces of ceremonial offerings, shells brought from the distant coast, fine textiles, and even human sacrifices, left as gifts to the unseen forces that governed the desert. This blending of the practical and the spiritual is key to understanding the Nazca. They engineered survival, but they also lived with a sense of fragility, of needing to constantly renew balance with the world around them. The desert was both their home and their enemy, generous in its valleys but merciless just beyond. And the Nazca did not appear in isolation. They inherited traditions from earlier peoples, especially the Paracas culture, which had flourished along Peru's southern coast before them. They were known for their extraordinary textiles and their elaborate burial practices. Mummies wrapped in layers upon layers of cloth, interred with offerings of food and tools. Some of the imagery that appears on Paracas textiles, such as flying shamans and supernatural beings, seems to foreshadow the motifs later etched into the Nazca desert floor. It's as if the Nazca took the symbolic language of their ancestors and magnified it on a scale no one had attempted before. Further back still, influences from the Chavin culture, a highland people famous for their temple at Chavin de Huantar, may also have shaped the Nazca worldview. The Chavin carved stone heads with fierce-fanged deities and spread religious iconography that fused human and animal traits. The idea that spiritual power flowed through transformations, through hybrids of jaguar, serpent and bird, seems to echo in Nazca art. The lines themselves, many depicting animals, may carry a shadow of these older beliefs. So the Nazca lived at a crossroads of tradition and invention. They built upon what came before, but they also created something startlingly new. Their environment forced them to see life as precarious, dependent on forces beyond their control. In that context, rituals took on urgent meaning. Each offering, each symbol, each work of art was a plea and a promise, an attempt to keep the fragile balance intact. And here's where the lines begin to make sense, at least in part. Imagine a people who had mastered the art of irrigation, but still lived in fear of drought. A people who decorated their pottery with images of animals tied to fertility and abundance. A people who believed their rituals could shape the forces of nature. Is it so surprising that they might also carve enormous figures into the desert, visible to the sky, as if addressing the powers above? But before we leap to conclusions, it's worth pausing. The Nazca were not just mystics scratching prayers into the sand. They were careful builders. The lines themselves reveal a technique both simple and ingenious. The desert floor is covered with a layer of dark stones weathered by sun and wind. Just beneath lies a lighter soil, almost white by contrast. By scraping away the top layer, the Nazca exposed that lighter ground, creating a visible line. Once made, the dryness of the desert preserved it. With no rain to wash it away and little wind to disturb it, the lines could endure for centuries. What's striking is the precision. Some of the straight lines run for miles, arrow straight, without wavering. To walk them is to feel the deliberate hand of measurement. Archaeologists believe they use simple tools, wooden stakes and ropes to keep their alignments true. In fact, experiments have shown that with nothing more than those tools, people today can reproduce the same scale and accuracy the Nazca achieved. No advanced technology was required, just planning, coordination, and a collective vision. Even knowing how the lines could have been made, the question remains, why? Why would people already struggling with the basics of survival, devote such energy to carving enormous figures that could never be fully appreciated from the ground? That question leads us deeper into their symbolic world, where art, ritual and engineering were never far apart. The Nazca didn't separate the practical from the sacred. Building aqueducts to channel water and carving giant spirals into the desert might both serve the same purpose, to honour the forces that made life possible. It's tempting to think of them as mysterious or alien in their choices, but in many ways they weren't so different from us. We build cathedrals far larger than necessary, not for shelter but for meaning. We launch monuments into space, knowing no one may see them, but wanting to send a message beyond ourselves. The Nazca, facing their own fragile existence, turned the desert into their cathedral, their canvas, their message board to the unseen. That's where the story of the ancient builders becomes inseparable from the story of the lines. They were not simply farmers or artisans or engineers. They were all of those at once, bound together by the desert's demands. Their survival depended on ingenuity, but their spirit demanded expression. And in the tension between those needs, the lines began to emerge, not as isolated works of art, but as part of a whole culture's way of seeing the world. To really grasp the Nazca world, it helps to picture not just their daily survival, but their rituals. Because the desert was not merely an obstacle, it was the stage for their relationship with the forces they believed governed life itself. Archaeologists have found signs of large ceremonial gatherings across the valleys. Platforms of adobe and stone were built for rituals. Offerings of food, textiles and seashells from the distant Pacific were placed in the ground. Why seashells? For the Nazca, the ocean was a source of fertility, a realm of abundance, and bringing shells into the desert was like transporting the essence of water itself. In a place where rain rarely fell, seashells became powerful symbols of life. There is evidence, too, of human sacrifice. Burials have been uncovered where young men were carefully interred, often decapitated, with heads placed as offerings. Some skulls show holes drilled through the forehead, as if cords were threaded to display them. This practice, while unsettling to us, fit into a worldview where blood and life force were the most precious gifts that could be given to the gods. These sacrifices were not casual violence. They were sacred exchanges, performed to secure the blessings of fertility, rain, and balance in the desert. We can also see how their rituals tied directly to agriculture. Pottery fragments found at the edges of the lines often depict maize, beans, and fruits. It seems that some ceremonies were timed to planting and harvest seasons. If you lived in a place where one bad year could destroy your community, would you not pour every ounce of energy into rituals that promise to align human effort with cosmic favour? This makes the Nazca lines begin to look less like art for its own sake, and more like part of a ritual landscape. Imagine a group of people walking along the lines, carrying offerings, chanting prayers. The lines weren't just symbols to be seen, they were pathways to be experienced. To walk them was to participate in a ceremony, to trace the shape of a hummingbird or a spiral with your own feet, as if embodying the connection between earth and sky. Weaving played its part in this symbolic world too. Nazca textiles are filled with imagery of plants, animals and hybrid beings, figures with wings, masks and fangs. These designs suggest a culture where boundaries between natural and supernatural were porous. Shamans may have used hallucinogenic plants such as San Pedro cactus to enter altered states. In those states, visions of flight, transformation and cosmic journeys may have inspired the very shapes carved into the desert. The hummingbird geoglyph, for example, echoes the hummingbird often painted on their pottery and woven into their cloth. For the Nazca, that tiny bird, capable of darting quickly and drinking nectar, may have symbolized life's fragile but persistent renewal. The more you examine their art, the more you see patterns. Spiders, for example, appear often. They were not chosen at random. In desert mythologies across South America, spiders were linked with rain, because spider webs glisten with droplets after rare showers. To etch a spider hundreds of feet long into the desert floor may have been a prayer written on the earth itself, asking for rain. The monkey, another famous figure, may have symbolized fertility and abundance. Monkeys were not native to the arid Nazca plain, but they were known from the wetter Amazon region to the east. Bringing that image into the desert was perhaps a way of invoking the lushness of distant lands. The condor, soaring high above the Andes, represented a messenger between earth and heaven. Each figure etched into the plain carried layers of meaning that tied the local struggle for survival to a cosmic order. It is worth remembering how fragile this existence was. The Nazca Plain offered no guarantees. Droughts could last for years. In fact, evidence from soil studies suggests that severe droughts eventually played a role in the Nazca culture's decline. When rivers dried up, no amount of engineering or ritual could fully compensate. That fragility must have weighed on every generation, feeding a sense that the community's survival depended on staying in harmony with forces larger than themselves. One story told through archaeology captures this poignantly. In one excavation near a geoglyph, researchers uncovered a collection of broken pottery vessels deliberately smashed and left in the desert. These weren't accidents. They were intentional offerings. The vessels, once beautiful and whole, were shattered as a way of releasing their essence, their value to the gods. To us, breaking something precious might feel destructive. To them, it was an act of giving, a way of turning material wealth into spiritual currency. The desert floor became an altar, and the lines became the sacred boundaries of that space. In the wider Andes, there are parallels. Other cultures built large ritual landscapes, often tied to mountains, rivers, and the cycles of the sun and moon. The Nazca were not alone in seeing geography as infused with spiritual meaning, but their choice, to inscribe their beliefs directly onto the desert in shapes visible from above, was unique. It suggests a worldview where communication with the divine was not only vertical, through mountains reaching to the sky, but also horizontal through the earth itself as a canvas. What makes this especially striking is the combination of modest daily life with monumental ritual effort. Nazca villages were not large cities like those of the Inca centuries later. They had no massive stone temples or towering pyramids. Instead, their greatest monument was the desert itself. While others raised walls of stone, the Nazca cleared the ground to reveal images the earth already contained. It was, in a sense, architecture without walls, a sacred space defined by absence rather than presence. And perhaps that is why the Nazca lines endure as such a powerful mystery. They reflect a culture whose ingenuity was born from scarcity, whose rituals were inseparable from survival, and whose imagination reached beyond the limits of the visible. To live in the Nazca world was to be constantly negotiating with forces of drought and abundance, with life and death. Every artifact, from a woven textile to a spiral well, was part of that negotiation. The lines, then, were the grandest expression of it all, the point where engineering, art, and faith converged. It's easy, from our vantage point, to underestimate ancient peoples, to think of them as locked in survival without higher aspirations. But the Nazca challenge that assumption. They were survivors, yes, but also visionaries. They bent the desert to their needs with aqueducts, and they bent meaning itself into the earth with geoglyphs. For them, the two acts may have been the same, both essential, both sacred, both ways of ensuring that life could go on. So when we ask how the lines were made, the answer is simple, with stones removed by hand, with ropes, and stakes to keep things straight. But when we ask why, the answer lies not in the technique, but in the culture that shaped it. A culture where every act of survival was also an act of faith. That is the paradox of the Nazca. A people both ordinary and extraordinary, leaving behind simple homes and daily tools, but also a desert-wide masterpiece still visible centuries later. To understand them is not to reduce the lines to irrigation ditches or roads. It is to see them as part of a larger whole, a way of life that blended practicality with spirituality in a seamless web. And with that, the stage is set. The desert builders have introduced themselves, their lives, their art, their rituals. All of it leads us to the lines themselves. Now, as we step into the next chapter, we can begin to ask, what do these enormous figures actually mean? When you look at a map of the Nazca Plain today, it's overwhelming. Hundreds of lines stretch across the desert like threads of an enormous invisible loom. But in order to feel their weight, it helps to step into them slowly, to picture each one not as an abstract puzzle but as a living presence on the ground. The hummingbird is the one most people know. From wingtip to wingtip, it spans more than 200 feet. The beak is a single straight line that seems to pierce toward infinity. What's striking is its delicacy. In a landscape where the sun bakes stones into blackness, someone removed just enough of those surface rocks to reveal pale soil beneath, thin as a brushstroke, steady as a surveyor's line. In Nazca pottery, hummingbirds appear again and again, always tied to flowers and nectar. In a desert where blossoms are fleeting, the hummingbird symbolized renewal, the fragile gift of fertility. Imagine walking along its wings, unable to see the bird but knowing each step is part of a form larger than yourself. Not far away lies the spider. Its body is only a few yards long, but its legs extend with perfect symmetry, stretching nearly 50 yards across. For the Nazca, spiders weren't random. They carried associations with rain. The moment a desert drizzle falls, spider webs glisten with drops, becoming tiny mirrors of abundance. Some scientists have suggested the geoglyph matches a rare long-legged spider species that emerges only during seasonal rains. If true, the carving may have been less a depiction and more a ritual invocation, a way of summoning water through the image of a creature bound to it. The monkey adds a different tone. Its spiral tail coils in a near-perfect curve, hypnotic in its sweep. Spirals are one of the most persistent motifs in Nazca art, appearing in textiles and pots alike. They may have represented cycles of water, seasons, or cosmic journeys. Monkeys themselves didn't live in the Nazca desert, but they thrived in the wetter forest to the east. By inscribing a monkey into the plain, the Nazca were perhaps importing fertility from faraway lands, calling lushness into their own arid world. Then there is the condor, wings stretched wide as though gliding over the Andes. The condor, immense in real life, was seen by Andean peoples as a messenger between worlds. It soared higher than any other bird, its flight brushing the heavens. Carving a condor into the earth could have been an act of communication, a way of sending prayers upward, carried on wings vast enough to be seen from the realm of the gods. More elusive are the sea creatures. A whale, hundreds of feet long, lies in the desert where no ocean has ever reached. Why carve it there? Perhaps because the ocean was part of their symbolic landscape. The Nazca often carried shells from the coast into rituals, treating them as gifts of fertility. A whale in the desert may have been a reminder that even the most barren land is tied to the abundance of distant waters. And then comes the figure that refuses to fit neatly anywhere, the so-called astronaut. Perched on a hillside rather than the flat plain, it depicts a humanoid with enormous eyes and a raised hand. Its proportions are strange, its presence eerie. Was it a shaman, depicted mid-transformation into something otherworldly? A deity wearing a mask? Or did it represent something entirely different, a being outside their world? Whatever its meaning, it has become one of the most iconic and unsettling of the geoglyphs, fueling imaginations far beyond archaeology. Beyond these recognizable figures lie countless geometric shapes, trapezoids stretching like landing strips, straight lines running arrow-true for miles, spirals unfurling into infinity. Some trapezoids narrow toward one end, like massive arrows pointing to the horizon. Others widen into broad bands, suggesting spaces where processions could have gathered, or rituals could have unfolded. These abstract shapes are harder to interpret than the animals, but perhaps more important. They dominate the desert in sheer number. Walking through the Nazca Plain, you realize how disorienting the scale is. From the ground, each line feels like nothing more than a path cleared of stones. There are no walls, no raised edges, nothing to mark grandeur. You can walk for half an hour and never realize you've traced only a fraction of a hummingbird's wing. The immensity can only be seen from the air, or perhaps from within the mind, if the purpose was not for the eye but for the ritual act of walking itself. The first outsiders to confront this puzzle were often at a loss. Local farmers knew of the markings but assumed they were old roads or paths. When pilots in the early 20th century began photographing them, the sheer scale shocked even seasoned archaeologists. Suddenly the desert revealed itself as a gallery of giants, its artwork hidden in plain sight for centuries. Some scholars tried to fit them into categories. Were they irrigation channels? That theory faltered, since many lines lead nowhere useful for water. Were they roads? Perhaps. But why carve roads in the shapes of animals visible only from above? It was in this climate of confusion that more systematic studies began. Archaeologists started mapping, counting, measuring. The deeper they looked, the more the desert yielded. By mid-century, hundreds of figures were catalogued. yet cataloguing did little to resolve the meaning. Instead, it only emphasized the enormity of the mystery. One researcher who refused to let go of that mystery was Maria Reich. Arriving in Peru in the 1930s, she devoted the rest of her life to the lines. She was often seen with a broom in hand, sweeping sand away to preserve the geoglyphs. With little money and no institutional backing, she lived simply in the desert, producing maps and studies by hand. Reicher's great conviction was that the lines were part of a massive astronomical calendar. She measured alignments between certain lines and the rising or setting points of the sun and stars. To her, the Nazca were sky watchers, etching constellations onto the ground to track agricultural cycles. The hummingbird was not only a bird but a celestial marker. The spider was not only an insect but a star pattern. For Reich, the desert was both observatory and book, a record written for those who could read the heavens. Her dedication inspired generations, though not all of her conclusions are accepted today. Statisticians argue that with so many lines, some are bound to align with astronomical events by chance. Still, Reicher's work brought the lines global attention. She transformed them from curiosities into cultural treasures, convincing Peru and the world of their importance. And yet, even with Reich's astronomical lens, the puzzle remains unsolved. Because every theory that explains one group of figures leaves others untouched. Some align with solstices, but many do not. Some suggest rituals, others maps of water, others still clan symbols. The Nazca lines refuse to be captured by one single key, but perhaps that resistance is their meaning. To walk among them is to accept ambiguity. You're inside a design you cannot see, part of a message you cannot read. From the desert floor you live in fragments. Only from above does the whole emerge. And maybe that was intentional, a way of reminding the human community that perspective belongs to the divine. So as we finish this first part of exploring the lines themselves, we stand at the edge of meaning. The figures astonish us, the pathways confound us, the astronomer's calendar tempts us. But the Nazca are not done speaking yet. Their symbols ask us to look again, to step deeper into interpretation. Because behind the forms lies the question: were these lines for the eyes of gods, the guidance of farmers, or the journeys of pilgrims? That is where the story now leads. One of the most enduring ideas is that the lines were ritual pathways. The long trapezoids and straight tracks weren't meant to be seen, but to be walked. Archaeologists have found broken pottery and offerings along some of the lines, as though participants carried vessels into the desert and smashed them deliberately. Imagine processions winding across the plain, families, priests, and dancers moving in rhythm, each footstep activating the shape beneath them. The design was not a picture but an experience, a choreography spread across the landscape. Some trapezoids widen as they stretch, giving the impression of an entrance leading to an open stage. Could these have been ceremonial gathering spaces? If so, then the geoglyphs weren't just art but stages for performance. The desert itself became a theatre of ritual, with the lines as its script. Another interpretation sees the figures as cosmic markers. Maria Reicher's astronomical calendar theory still resonates, even if not every alignment works out. Some lines do point to the rising or setting of the sun at solstices. Others seem to match the position of certain stars or constellations. For a people whose survival depended on predicting seasons, having a ritualized way of tracking celestial cycles would have been invaluable. The hummingbird might not only symbolize fertility on Earth, but also a celestial event tied to planting or harvest. But here's the complication. With so many lines, thousands of possible alignments exist. Critics argue that it's easy to find matches once you're looking for them. Some lines point to the solstice, but most do not. Does that invalidate the calendar idea, or does it mean the Nazca had multiple purposes layered into the desert? Perhaps the lines were not a single code but a palimpsest, with new groups adding new layers of meaning across centuries. Other archaeologists lean toward water theories. In a land where drought defined everything, it makes sense that water was at the center of ritual. Some trapezoids appear to align with the underground aqueducts, the puquios. Certain spirals resemble the spiral wells used to access groundwater. If true, the lines may have been both practical and symbolic, guiding people to water while invoking the spiritual forces that made water flow. Carving a spider, a monkey, or a condor wasn't just decoration. It was a prayer etched in stone, a plea for fertility, rain, and balance. There is also the idea of social identity. The Nazca culture wasn't a single unified empire like the Inca centuries later. It was a network of communities scattered along valleys. The desert plain may have been their meeting ground, a neutral stage where groups came together. Each animal figure might have represented a clan or lineage. Rituals on the lines could have been a way of binding these groups into a larger identity, connecting scattered villages through shared symbols too large for any one community alone. And then comes the question of scale. Why make something visible only from above? Some argue that the Nazca didn't intend for anyone to see the full figures at once. The act of walking them was the purpose. Others note that nearby hills do provide vantage points, not the high, sweeping view of an airplane, but enough to glimpse shapes and patterns. A shaman standing on a hillside could have directed ceremonies below, aware of the larger design invisible to those walking inside it. Still, the paradox remains. Most of the geoglyphs are comprehensible only from an aerial view. That fact is hard to ignore. It raises questions that go beyond ritual or astronomy. Was the very invisibility the point? Did the Nazca deliberately create works that humans could not see fully, reserving the complete vision for the gods above? If so, then the lines were less about human audiences and more about divine spectators. To carve a hummingbird hundreds of feet long wasn't to show it to your neighbour, it was to present it to the sky itself. The endurance of the lines adds to the mystery. For nearly 2 millennia, they've survived. The secret lies in the desert itself. The Nazca Plain is one of the driest places on Earth. With almost no rain, minimal wind, and a stable climate, the pale soil revealed by scraping away stones has remained exposed. In any other environment, the lines would have been erased within decades. Here, they endure almost untouched. The very harshness that made Nazca life so precarious became the safeguard of their greatest creation. What's fascinating is that every explanation leaves gaps. Ritual pathways explain the trapezoids, but not the condor. Calendars account for solstice alignments, but not the monkey's spiral tail. Water theories fit the spirals and pukios, but not the astronaut-like figure on the hillside. Social identity makes sense of clan symbols, but not the long straight lines that run for miles across empty ground. No single key unlocks the whole. And perhaps that is the meaning. The Nazca lines were not one thing but many, a cultural fabric woven of ritual, survival, identity, and faith. They were not designed for us to decode with a single theory. They were living symbols in a world where survival depended on the marriage of the practical and the sacred. Think of how we build cathedrals. They are places of worship, yes, but also calendars, marking the solstices with shafts of light through stained glass. They are social spaces binding communities, and they are art, filled with symbols that carry layers of meaning. The Nazca Desert was their cathedral, an open-air temple, a gathering ground, a cosmic book written on sand and stone. Standing there today, among the lines, you feel the same strangeness those first pilots must have felt. The desert, which seems so empty, suddenly brims with presence. Each path whispers of footsteps long gone. Each spiral hints at prayers once spoken. You realize you're walking through a dialogue between earth and sky, a dialogue still ongoing because the lines remain. And so, as we progress, the meaning of the geoglyphs remains suspended between possibilities. Ritual, astronomy, water, identity, all true in their own way, and yet none complete. The lines resist reduction. They are not riddles to be solved, but mysteries to be lived. Their power lies in that ambiguity, in their ability to make us pause, to wonder, to ask questions that echo across centuries. The Nazca left us their desert cathedral, but they never left us the key. And maybe that was deliberate. Maybe they wanted the lines to endure as questions, not answers, as invitations to reflection, not declarations of certainty. When people look at the Nazca lines, one of the first thoughts that often comes to mind is that they seem made for an audience far above the desert floor. The sheer scale of the figures feels out of proportion to human eyes on the ground. A hummingbird 200 feet across, a spider stretching with legs so long they vanish into the horizon, straight lines that run arrow true for miles. They make the most sense only when seen from the sky. And that raises a powerful question. Were these figures meant as messages, not for other people, but for gods looking down from the heavens. In many cultures around the world, sacred landscapes were created as offerings to higher powers. People carved hillsides, raised mounds, and shaped earthworks that could only be fully appreciated from an elevated view. In southern England, the Uffington White Horse sprawls across a chalk hillside, its outline visible for miles. In Ohio, the Serpent Mound winds its way across the ground, forming the coils of a snake swallowing an egg. These works weren't built for convenience or practicality. They were symbolic gestures on a massive scale, expressions of belief etched into the land itself. The Nazca Lines may have been part of that same impulse, the desire to shape the earth in ways that could reach the eyes of the divine. Walking the lines themselves may have been part of the ritual. Archaeologists suggest that processions could have moved along the paths, carrying offerings, singing, or dancing in patterns that traced the forms of animals and spirals. In that sense, the lines weren't just drawings, they were lived prayers. To walk a hummingbird was to embody its energy, to enact a dialogue with the powers it represented. Each step was an offering, each movement part of a larger communication. The animals themselves carried sacred meanings. The condor, soaring above the Andes, was a messenger between the earth and the heavens, a creature that could bridge human life with the divine realm above. The spider linked directly to rain and fertility, its presence tied to the rare blessing of water. The monkey, foreign to the desert, carried associations with abundance and exotic fertility from distant forests. Each figure, when walked and embodied, became more than an image. It became a prayer made physical. The trapezoids and spirals may have held their own symbolic power. Spirals are nearly universal as symbols of cycles, of water, seasons, birth, and death. To carve a spiral into the desert floor was to inscribe the turning of the cosmos itself. Trapezoids, narrowing to a point, may have represented pathways converging on sacred destinations, a funnel that guided energy or ritual toward the horizon. In a desert where survival depended on forces beyond human control, shaping the ground in such patterns could have felt like aligning human effort with cosmic order. The desert itself was a fitting stage for these messages. To live in Nazca country was to live in constant negotiation with extremes. Rain might not come for years, rivers could shrink to a trickle, crops might fail despite every effort. In that environment, the earth wasn't just soil, it was a living presence to be addressed, appeased and honoured. By carving lines into its surface, the Nazca may have been inscribing prayers directly onto the body of the earth, prayers large enough for the sky itself to witness. The absence of written language makes it difficult to know how these prayers were understood. Unlike the Maya or the Inca, the Nazca left no inscriptions that explain their symbols. What survives are images, on pottery, textiles and the desert floor. In each medium, the same motifs appear. Birds, spiders, monkeys, spirals. It's as though the same symbolic vocabulary was repeated in cloth, clay and stone. If the smaller works carried meaning for daily life and ritual, then the desert-scale works may have been their grandest expression. The same prayers, but magnified for divine eyes. In the high Andes, there was a long tradition of sacred geography. Mountains were considered living beings, deities known as apus, whose peaks connected earth with sky. Rivers, springs and stones were imbued with spirit. Every feature of the landscape was part of a sacred map, woven into human ritual. The Nazca, though living in the desert, may have shared this worldview. By transforming their plateau into a canvas of giant forms, they were extending the Andean tradition, making the land itself a partner in worship. One detail that deepens this perspective is the discovery of ritual objects at the lines. Archaeologists have found offerings of pottery fragments, seashells, and even small altars placed at intersections. These weren't random leftovers, they were deliberate acts of giving. A pot smashed at the foot of a geoglyph was a sacrifice, its destruction a way of releasing its essence to the gods. A shell brought from the distant sea was a symbol of fertility and abundance, placed in the heart of a barren plain as a plea for life. The desert became a temple, the lines its aisles and altars. If these designs were indeed messages to the gods, then they remind us how scale itself can be a form of devotion. In our own history, we see the same impulse. Cathedrals were built on a scale far beyond human need, their spires reaching to heaven. The Great Wall of China stretched across mountains, not merely for defense but as a statement of power and cosmic order. To build big is to declare reverence, to prove devotion through labor that exceeds practical limits. The Nazca may have been doing the same, proving their faith by reshaping miles of desert into a message too large for human eyes alone. This perspective also reframes the question of invisibility. Why make something so vast you cannot see it yourself? From a practical standpoint, it seems absurd. But if the intended audience was divine, then human visibility was irrelevant. The gods didn't need to stand on hillsides, they looked from the heavens. The fact that humans couldn't see the full figures may have been part of the ritual logic, a way of underscoring that these works were not for mortals, but for powers beyond them. Even myths and oral traditions, though scarce, hint at this kind of communication. Later Andean cultures often described the desert as a place of contact between worlds, where shamans could journey to other realms. The silence, the emptiness, the vastness, all of it made the desert a liminal space, a threshold between human life and the divine. The Nazca lines, carved into this landscape, may have been intended as permanent thresholds, inscribed doors through which prayers could rise. To imagine the Nazca walking those lines under the burning sun is to imagine devotion on a scale that humbles us. They had no guarantee their prayers would be answered. They knew drought might still come, and yet they carved the desert with faith that the gods above would see. Each spiral, each trapezoid, each animal was both an offering and a plea, a way of transforming desperation into beauty. It is worth pausing on that thought. Across the world, humans have turned suffering into ritual, fragility into art, fear into devotion. The Nazca lines may be one of the purest expressions of that impulse. They are fragile scratches in the earth, yet they have endured longer than empires. If they were indeed messages to the gods, then they stand as the most patient letters ever written. Prayers stretched across centuries still legible in the silence of the desert. The deeper you look into the Nazca Desert, the more you notice that the geoglyphs are not only animals and straight tracks. Many of them are abstract, trapezoids narrowing into the distance, spirals that unfurl endlessly, zigzags and shapes whose meaning is harder to pin down. These forms are not mere decoration. They suggest a symbolic language, one that uses geometry itself as a way of speaking with the unseen. Spirals, for example, appear everywhere in the ancient world. In the Andes, they often symbolize cycles of water, fertility, and rebirth. The endless loop mirrored rivers that return with the seasons, the turning of the stars, the journey from life into death and back again. To carve a spiral into the desert may have been to inscribe eternity itself, a prayer for continuity in a land where continuity was never guaranteed. The trapezoids are just as intriguing. Wide at one end and narrowing at the other, they feel directional, as though pointing towards something beyond the horizon. Some researchers suggest they were ritual runways, spaces where groups of people gathered and walked, funneled into a sacred destination. Others wonder if they represented rays of the sun, or pathways for spirits descending from the heavens. Whatever their exact meaning, their sheer size conveys purpose. They were built to guide attention, to draw energy from one point to another, as though the desert itself had become a map of unseen journeys. Comparisons with other cultures reveal how universal this impulse can be. In Britain, the Uffington White Horse sprawls across a hillside, its chalk lines only fully visible from above. To the builders, its audience was never merely human. It was a gesture to the gods, a symbol inscribed so large it could be seen from the sky. In North America, the Serpent Mound coils across the landscape, its body stretching hundreds of feet, head poised to swallow an egg. Scholars believe it was tied to cosmology, solstices, and fertility rites. Like the Nazca lines, it fuses earth and meaning, creating a sacred geography intended to bridge human life and the divine. These parallels suggest that the Nazca were part of a broader human tradition, shaping the land not just for survival, but as a form of dialogue with the cosmos. Earthworks on this scale are never practical. They are devotional acts, labours of faith. Still, the Nazca's choice to build on a flat desert plateau rather than a hillside adds something unique. On a slope, like the White Horse, you can see the design from across a valley. On the plain, you cannot. The figures are invisible from the ground, This makes the Nazca Lines one of the most radical statements in ancient art. They were not built for human audiences at all. Their only full viewers were in the sky, gods, spirits, or perhaps the ancestors watching from above. That invisibility may have been deliberate, a reminder that not all sacred acts are meant for human eyes. The desert itself reinforces that point. The silence is overwhelming, the horizons stretching in every direction. To walk among the lines is to be surrounded by emptiness, a place where the human voice feels small. In such a setting, the act of carving shapes into the ground could feel like calling out into the void, leaving signs large enough for the heavens to notice. Each geoglyph becomes both prayer and proclamation, etched into a silence so vast it seems infinite. Even the scarcity of myths about the lines may be telling. Oral traditions fade, and the Nazca left no written language. Later cultures in Peru spoke of deserts as liminal places, thresholds where shamans could cross into other realms. The lines may have been part of that tradition, permanent pathways into the sacred. The fact that we cannot know for sure only deepens the sense that they were meant to be mysteries, their meanings accessible only to those who walk them in ritual. The idea of sacred geometry here is worth considering. Across the world, geometric patterns have been used to express harmony between human life and cosmic order. Circles, spirals, triangles, they all carry weight beyond mathematics. They become bridges between the visible and the invisible. For the Nazca, carving trapezoids, spirals, and endless straight lines may have been a way of tuning their world to the universe. Just as a musician tunes an instrument to match the scale of a song, the Nazca may have tuned their desert to the scale of the cosmos. And then there is the question of the sky itself. Were the lines intended to be seen from above? From the air, they are astonishing. From the ground, they vanish. To us, living in an age of flight, the aerial perspective seems natural. But for the Nazca, who never flew, what mattered was not human eyes but divine perception. The gods, they may have believed, looked down. The sky was alive, filled with watchers, and the desert was the stage where you performed your devotion for them. In that sense, the Nazca Lines remind us that visibility is relative. They are invisible to humans, but perfectly visible to the beings they were meant for. The fact that they endured for centuries without discovery by outsiders may have been part of their sacredness. Hidden in plain sight, the desert cathedral waited, untouched, until the age of flight revealed it. When archaeologists find offerings near the lines, pottery deliberately broken, shells placed in careful arrangements, small altars built on the plain, they confirm this sense of sacred intent. These were not random works. They were integrated into rituals that transformed the desert into a holy ground. Each geoglyph was a prayer etched into earth and activated by ceremony. The endurance of the lines, surviving nearly 2,000 years, adds a final layer of wonder. They are messages that outlasted their makers, surviving not only for gods, but for future generations who would puzzle over them. Whether or not their prayers were answered, the Nazca succeeded in creating something that continues to speak, even if its words remain veiled. It is humbling to think of how fragile each line is. Only a shallow groove in the ground, a few inches deep, a few feet wide, and yet together they form messages that stretch for miles. Fragile scratches, preserved only because the desert refused to erase them, have become one of humanity's great mysteries. They remind us that sometimes the most delicate marks endure the longest, especially when they carry the weight of devotion. Standing at the edge of a trapezoid or inside the spiral tail of a monkey, or along the straight flight of a hummingbird's beak, you feel part of a pattern too large to see. That may be the essence of the experience, to participate in a mystery without ever controlling it, to trust that what you enact on the ground is visible in full to powers greater than yourself. And so the Nazca Lines continue to invite reflection. Were they truly messages to the gods? If so, then they are among the most beautiful letters ever written, prayers cast into the sky with the patience of centuries. The desert holds them still, silent and enduring, as though the conversation between earth and heaven never really ended. By the middle of the 20th century, the Nazca Lines had already captured the imagination of archaeologists, pilots, and curious travellers. But it was in the 1960s and 70s that the mystery leapt beyond the academy and into popular culture. This was the moment when the lines became part of a much bigger story, not just about ancient Peru, but about humanity's place in the universe. and at the centre of that shift was a Swiss author named Erich von Däniken. In 1968, he published a book with a provocative title, Chariots of the Gods. His argument was simple and startling. Throughout human history, von Däniken claimed, the gods were not gods at all, but visitors from other worlds. Ancient monuments and myths, he suggested, were evidence of extraterrestrials who had visited Earth and left their mark. Among his many examples, the Nazca Lines stood out. To him, they weren't ritual pathways or calendars. They were runways, landing strips for spacecraft. The idea was electrifying. Suddenly, the barren desert of southern Peru was no longer just an archaeological site. It was a potential spaceport, a place where alien ships might once have descended. Photographs of the trapezoids, long and straight, were reimagined as airstrips, their mile-long breadth perfect for a craft coming in from the sky. The astronaut figure carved on a hillside became, in this telling, not a shaman or deity, but a depiction of an actual alien being. Round eyes, raised hand, as though greeting or warning us across time. Von Däniken's claims met with fierce criticism from scholars. Archaeologists pointed out that the lines were shallow, just a few inches deep, hardly the kind of durable surface you'd want for heavy landing craft. The trapezoids, they argued, were ceremonial spaces not engineered for flight. And yet, for many readers, the logic of scale was compelling. If the figures could only be seen from above, wasn't that itself evidence of aerial perspective? And if humans of the Nazca period had no way to fly, then who was the intended viewer? What gave von Däniken's theory traction was timing. The 1960s were an age of space fever. Humans were reaching beyond Earth for the first time, sending probes to the moon and planets, preparing for the Apollo landings. The idea that our ancestors might have been visited by extraterrestrials resonated with a generation looking outward. Television shows like Star Trek filled screens with alien encounters. UFO sightings made headlines. Against that backdrop, the Nazca Desert seemed to fit perfectly into the narrative of cosmic connection. The ancient astronaut theory soon spread far beyond von Däniken's book. Documentaries picked it up, magazines featured it, and popular shows presented the lines as proof that humanity had once been in contact with beings from the stars. Tourists flocked to Nazca not just to see a mystery of archaeology, but to glimpse what some believed was evidence of interplanetary exchange. At the heart of the fascination was the astronaut geoglyph. Its large round eyes seemed uncannily modern, like the face of a visitor in a space helmet. Its hand, raised as if in greeting, was interpreted as a signal across time. For those inclined to see alien influence, it became the perfect icon, a desert billboard announcing contact with another world. Pilots and engineers sometimes added fuel to the speculation. Looking at aerial photographs, some remarked on how straight and long the trapezoids were, how they resembled runways. The fact that they were etched on a flat plateau added to the impression. To someone primed by the space age, it wasn't hard to imagine spacecraft descending onto the Nazca plain, using the lines as guides, but the criticisms were just as strong. Archaeologists countered that the lines showed none of the wear you'd expect from landing craft. There was no scorching, no compression, no disturbance that couldn't be explained by human footsteps and simple scraping. And while the trapezoids might look like airstrips from the air, on the ground they were ceremonial spaces, broad enough to host processions but far too fragile for machines. Yet the allure of the alien hypothesis was never really about evidence. It was about imagination. To think that the Nazca Desert might once have been visited by beings from beyond was to connect ourselves to a larger cosmic story. It turned a local mystery into a universal one, and that perhaps is why the idea endures even when experts dismiss it. For many people, the ancient astronaut theory also offered a kind of re-enchantment of history. Instead of seeing the Nazca as ordinary humans, struggling against drought and hunger, it painted them as part of a cosmic drama. They became collaborators with visitors from the stars, builders of messages or landing sites for otherworldly beings. In a world where modern technology can make ancient peoples seem primitive by comparison, this theory flipped the script. Suddenly, the ancients weren't behind us. They were connected to something beyond us. It is worth noting too how stories about aliens often reflect the times that produced them. In the Cold War era, when rockets and satellites dominated headlines, it made sense to see the past through the lens of space travel. The Nazca Lines became runways because the world was full of talk about launches, orbits, and landings. Just as earlier generations had seen them as irrigation ditches or roads, the space age saw them as airports for extraterrestrials. The popularity of this idea had lasting effects. Even today, countless books, television shows, and websites continue to present the Nazca Lines as evidence of alien contact. Tour guides in Peru sometimes frame them this way for visitors. Popular culture has embraced the image of the Nazca Desert as a cosmic billboard, a place where humanity might once have met the stars. What is fascinating is how resilient the idea is, even when evidence contradicts it. Rational explanations, ritual pathways, astronomical calendars, water ceremonies have grown stronger with new archaeological discoveries. But the alien hypothesis persists, not because it fits the facts better, but because it speaks to something deep in the human imagination. We want to believe that we are not alone, that someone once came to us from the sky, and that they left signs we can still read. So the desert holds two parallel stories. One is the story of a people who lived with drought, who built aqueducts, who carved their prayers into the ground. The other is the story we have projected onto them, that they were part of a cosmic encounter, hosts or witnesses to visitors from the stars. Both stories say something about humanity. One speaks to our resilience, the other to our longing for connection beyond the Earth. The Nazca Lines, in this light, are not only an archaeological mystery, they are a mirror, reflecting our own hopes and fears across time. When we see trapezoids as airstrips, we are seeing our own fascination with flight and space. When we imagine the astronaut figure as an alien, we are imagining ourselves reaching beyond human limits. Whether or not visitors ever came, the desert has become a canvas for our most enduring question: are we alone? As the decades rolled on, the idea that the Nazca Lines might have been connected to extraterrestrials didn't fade away. Instead, it embedded itself deeper into public imagination. Books, documentaries, and later television series wove the desert into a global story of ancient aliens. The plain of Nazca was no longer just a Peruvian puzzle. It became a stage for speculation about humanity's contact with the cosmos. Part of the reason this idea endured is because the images themselves lend to wonder. Photographs of the trapezoids do look like runways from the air. The long straight lines resemble guides for navigation. The astronaut figure seems uncannily suited to modern eyes trained to recognize helmets and visors. These resemblances are coincidences, but powerful ones. They give just enough plausibility to spark belief, especially when framed by a persuasive narrator. Television amplified the effect. In the 1970s, programs that combined archaeology with fringe speculation reached wide audiences. The Nazca Desert often featured as a highlight, its barren beauty and mysterious shapes ideal for dramatic shots from above. Later, in the 21st century, series dedicated entirely to the ancient aliens theme made Nazca a recurring icon. Each episode replayed the same images: the monkey's spiral tail, the condor's vast wings, the trapezoid plains. Over and over, they were presented as messages not to gods, but to spacecraft. What's interesting is how little the actual evidence mattered in these portrayals. Archaeologists had long since demonstrated that the lines could be made with simple tools, that they showed no signs of landings, and that their symbolism fit naturally into Nazca culture. But for viewers, the attraction wasn't evidence, it was mystery. To imagine that the desert might once have welcomed visitors from another world was more thrilling than pottery fragments or irrigation canals. This dynamic reveals something about the way mysteries live in human culture. When an explanation is uncertain, multiple narratives can coexist. Archaeologists may emphasize ritual pathways, astronomers may emphasize solstices, but storytellers and dreamers emphasize the possibility of aliens. Each narrative serves a different purpose. One satisfies scholarly curiosity, another satisfies existential longing. And perhaps the alien hypothesis persists because it offers something emotionally compelling. It suggests that humanity was never alone, that in our earlier struggles we were noticed, even guided by beings far beyond us. In a universe that often feels silent, that thought is comforting. It transforms the Nazca Lines from local prayers into cosmic correspondence, as if our ancestors had already entered into a dialogue we are still yearning to continue. Yet the endurance of this idea also comes with its complications. For archaeologists, the alien narrative can be frustrating because it often overshadows the achievements of the Nazca themselves. Suggesting that extraterrestrials built or inspired the lines risks denying the ingenuity of the people who actually carved them. It shifts credit away from a culture that found ways to survive and create beauty in one of the harshest environments on Earth. To say aliens did it is, in a way, to underestimate human potential. But even that criticism has a curious twist, because the very persistence of the alien theory points to how extraordinary the Nazca accomplishment really is. The lines are so vast, so precise, so enigmatic, that people find it hard to believe they could have been made without outside help. In that sense, the alien hypothesis is backhanded admiration. It testifies to how staggering the lines appear, too staggering, some think, for ordinary human hands. The story also reflects the way popular imagination often moves faster than academic caution. Archaeologists sift through soil, date pottery, compare iconography, and build careful models of ritual life. Popular culture leaps straight to the stars. The desert, silent and immense, becomes a canvas for the grandest possibilities. Between those poles, the grounded and the speculative, the Nazca lines continue to live. Why does the idea linger even now in an age of satellites and drones that have given us clearer views of the lines than ever before? Perhaps because the lines still resist a single definitive explanation. Ritual, astronomy, water, identity. All of these theories explain parts of the puzzle, but not the whole. That gap, that space of uncertainty, is where alien stories thrive. They step into the void left by unanswered questions and fill it with narrative, and so the desert becomes a mirror. For archaeologists, it reflects the ingenuity of an ancient culture. For believers in alien contact, it reflects a longing for cosmic connection. For casual visitors, it reflects the thrill of encountering something enormous, beautiful and unexplained. The same lines, the same spirals, the same trapezoids, yet each person sees a different story written into the ground. There is a lesson in that. The Nazca lines are not only a mystery from the past, they are also a stage for the present, where our own hopes and fears play out. The idea of aliens, of messages to the stars, of landing strips in the desert, these are not just about what the Nazca may have believed. They're about what we believe, what we imagine, and what we hope might be true. It is easy to dismiss the alien hypothesis as fanciful, but it has its own kind of truth. Not a truth of archaeology, but a truth of longing. It speaks to the human desire to be part of a larger story, to believe that the universe has noticed us, that somewhere out there someone came and saw and perhaps will return. The Nazca lines, with their silent grandeur, are the perfect canvas for that dream. And in that way, the desert performs a double duty. It holds the memory of a people who carved their prayers into the earth, and it holds the projections of later generations who see those prayers as cosmic correspondence. Both layers coexist, not erasing each other but entwined. The reality of human ingenuity and the fantasy of alien visitation share the same space, just as the lines themselves share the same plane. Whether one believes in extraterrestrial runways or human ritual pathways, the fact remains that the Nazca lines are extraordinary. They are vast, delicate, enduring. They invite us to imagine both the hands that made them and the eyes that were meant to see them. And in that invitation they connect us, not only to the Nazca people of 2,000 years ago, but to the possibilities we still dream about today. For centuries, the Nazca lines lay hidden in plain sight. They were too large to be seen from the ground, too subtle to be noticed without elevation, and too remote to draw much attention. It wasn't until the age of flight that they emerged into view, and even then, much of their extent remained unknown. What changed everything was the arrival of new technologies, satellites circling the Earth, aerial drones, and advanced imaging tools capable of peeling back layers of the desert in ways the human eye never could. One of the first great shifts came with systematic aerial photography. By the mid-20th century, planes flying low over the Nazca Plain captured hundreds of geoglyphs never before mapped. Archaeologists could finally see patterns, clusters, and alignments that were impossible to grasp from the ground. These early surveys created the foundation of modern Nazca studies, but they were still limited. The desert is vast, and many figures remained hidden by erosion, covered by shifting dust, or simply too faint to notice at a glance. In recent decades, satellites added a new perspective. Orbiting high above the Earth, they offered wide views that revealed just how sprawling the geoglyph network really is. What once seemed confined to a single plane turned out to be part of a much larger ritual landscape, stretching across valleys and plateaus. Lines once thought isolated were connected to others miles away. Suddenly, the Nazca Lines were not just a set of figures but part of a vast integrated system woven into the desert itself. The real revolution, however, came with drones. Lightweight, maneuverable, and able to fly low over the desert without disturbing the ground, drones opened the Nazca landscape in ways previously unimaginable. Archaeologists began deploying them to scan regions that had never been properly surveyed. Almost immediately, new geoglyphs emerged. In 2014, Japanese researchers using drones discovered dozens of previously unknown figures, animals, humanoids, and abstract shapes too faint to be seen from above by satellite, but clear when captured at just the right angle and light. One of the most striking finds came in 2020, when a team announced the discovery of a giant cat etched into a hillside. Its body stretched for more than 100 feet, drawn with a simplicity that seemed almost cartoonish. For decades it had lain unnoticed, eroded nearly to invisibility. Only when archaeologists carefully cleared away the overgrown surface did the feline emerge again, its outlines suddenly sharp against the desert slope. The cat joined a growing catalogue of geoglyphs that continues to expand, reminding us that the Nazca Desert still holds secrets waiting for rediscovery. These new figures reveal that the Nazca tradition was even richer and more varied than previously thought. Birds, fish, and even fantastical creatures have been added to the list, each carrying symbolic resonance. The sheer number of geoglyphs now catalogued, more than 1,000, suggests a culture that poured immense energy into this form of expression, generation after generation. The desert, far from barren, was a living canvas constantly added to, maintained, and renewed. Advances in ground-level archaeology have added further layers of understanding. Excavations near some lines uncovered fragments of pottery, textiles, and ritual offerings. These finds support the idea that the lines were not abstract decorations but part of ceremonial activities. Broken pots, shells carried from the coast, and even small altars were placed deliberately, evidence of rituals carried out in the desert's silence. Each offering tied the human community to the geoglyphs, turning them from static images into active participants in religious life. Some experiments have even recreated how the lines could have been built. Archaeologists and local volunteers have demonstrated that with nothing more than wooden stakes, ropes, and simple tools, it is possible to construct figures of immense size with remarkable precision. By laying out a grid with stakes and using ropes to guide straight lines or curves, the Nazca could create enormous forms without ever needing to see the whole. The process was communal, requiring planning and cooperation, but no advanced technology. These reconstructions underline a humbling truth. The Nazca didn't need outside help to achieve their feat. Human ingenuity, patience, and coordination were enough. Astronomical studies have also revisited old debates. Using precise measurements and computer simulations, researchers tested which lines align with solstices, equinoxes, and star risings. Some alignments hold up, especially with the sun during solstice periods. Others appear coincidental, the result of sheer numbers. What emerges is a nuanced picture. The Nazca likely did pay attention to the heavens, but not every line was an astronomical marker. Instead, some were, and those may have carried special significance tied to agriculture and ritual calendars. At the same time, climate studies have added another dimension. Geological evidence shows that the Nazca region experienced cycles of drought and flood. When El Niño events struck, heavy rains could devastate the fragile ecosystem, washing away crops and altering river flows. These extremes may have been part of what drove the Nazca to carve the desert. By inscribing animals tied to fertility, by creating pathways tied to water sources, they were addressing the unpredictable climate itself. The lines became a way of negotiating with forces that could not be controlled, only pleaded with. Taken together, all these strands, satellites, drones, excavations, experiments, climate models, paint a picture of the Nazca not as mystics reaching blindly for meaning, but as ritual engineers. They lived in a landscape of scarcity, and they developed strategies that blended the practical with the symbolic. Their aqueducts tapped hidden water, while their geoglyphs invoked cosmic and natural powers. The lines weren't an anomaly detached from daily life. They were part of a whole system of survival, belief, and adaptation. Yet even as science sharpens the picture, it does not dissolve the mystery. For every geoglyph newly discovered, for every offering uncovered, new questions emerge. Why these specific animals? Why so many trapezoids? Why build at such a massive scale knowing that no human eye could ever see the figures in their entirety? The tools of archaeology can answer how, and sometimes when, but the deeper question of why remains open. That may be what keeps the Nazca Lines so compelling. Even under the scrutiny of satellites and drones, they resist being reduced to a single explanation. They are ritual pathways, but also symbols of fertility. They are tied to astronomy, but not entirely. They are practical in method, but transcendent in scale. They live in the space between categories, part engineering, part art, part prayer. The desert, after all, is still there. It holds the lines in silence as it has for nearly 2,000 years. From the air, new patterns continue to appear. On the ground, archaeologists uncover offerings that whisper of vanished ceremonies. Every discovery adds to the richness of the story, but the whole remains just out of reach, like a figure too large to see except from the sky. The most astonishing realization of recent years is that the Nazca Desert is still revealing its figures. For generations, people assumed the catalogue was complete. The spider, the monkey, the hummingbird, the condor, the astronaut. But every new survey shows that the canvas is far larger than anyone imagined. In 2014, a team of Japanese researchers used drones to scan a stretch of desert that had never been systematically studied. What they found upended expectations. More than 40 new geoglyphs, many faint and eroded, depicting humanoid figures, llamas, birds, and abstract shapes. These weren't hidden because they were small. Some stretched over 100 feet. They had simply blended into the landscape, invisible until viewed from just the right height and angle. Then, in 2020, another discovery caught worldwide attention. On a hillside overlooking the Nazca Plain, archaeologists uncovered the outline of a massive cat. For decades, the design had lain almost erased by erosion. Cleaning the slope revealed its body stretched more than 100 feet, drawn in a style distinct from the better-known figures. The feline, playful and almost cartoon-like, reminded researchers that the Nazca tradition was not a single monolithic project. It was a living practice, adapting over centuries, shaped by new generations of artists and priests. As discoveries like these accumulate, the sheer variety is striking. Alongside the familiar desert animals appear creatures of the ocean, whales, pelicans, fish, reminding us of the Nazca's ties to the Pacific coast. Some figures resemble hybrids, part human, part beast, echoing shamanic imagery found in Nazca pottery and textiles. Others are purely geometric, bold trapezoids and zigzags that may have structured processions or marked sacred territories. Each new find expands the vocabulary of symbols, suggesting that the desert was a conversation carried out over centuries rather than a single, monumental statement. Dating techniques confirm this. By analysing soil deposits and examining superimposed lines, archaeologists have learned that the geoglyphs were created over an enormous span of time, from around 200 years before Christ to as late as AD 600. This means that generation after generation returned to the desert to add, renew, and reimagine the figures. Some were erased or overlapped by later ones, showing that the desert was not a static gallery, but a constantly updated landscape of meaning. Excavations around several geoglyphs add more texture to this picture. At the edges of certain lines, archaeologists uncovered clusters of post holes. These may have supported wooden markers or ceremonial structures now long gone. In one case, near a trapezoid, a ring of post holes suggests a temporary platform, perhaps for priests or musicians who led rituals. At another site, deposits of pigments were found, hinting that colours may have been part of ceremonies even if they left no trace on the desert floor. These details remind us that the lines were not isolated drawings. They were embedded in a wider ritual world, full of sound, movement and performance. Modern research also highlights the social dimension of the geoglyphs. Building figures of such scale required cooperation. Even with simple tools, organising the labour of dozens or hundreds of people to align ropes, place markers and clear stones demanded coordination. In a culture spread across valleys, with small villages rather than great cities, these projects may have been one of the few ways to unite communities. Walking together in ritual, working side by side to carve a condor's wing or a spiral's curve, the Nazca turned the desert into both a sacred stage and a political space. This view is strengthened by studies of settlement patterns. Villages across the region appear modest, but the lines tie them together into a shared ritual landscape. Each valley may have contributed figures tied to its own symbols, a clan animal, a totemic bird, while the great straight lines and trapezoids provided neutral grounds for collective ceremonies. The desert became a place where dispersed communities enacted unity through shared labour and shared belief. Scientific reconstructions add another layer. Experimental archaeologists have shown that a small team can create enormous figures using nothing more than wooden stakes and knotted ropes. The precision of the straight lines running arrow true for miles emerges naturally from this method. Curves and spirals can be plotted mathematically with surprising accuracy. These experiments prove that the Nazca needed no mysterious technology, no lost machines, only patience, organisation, and a clear vision of what they wanted to inscribe. What drones and satellites also reveal is the density of the geoglyphs. Many overlap, cross, or interrupt each other. Some trapezoids cut across older animal figures, straight lines bisect spirals. Rather than disorder, this suggests renewal. Each new generation may have felt compelled to inscribe its own prayers over the landscape, layering meaning on meaning. The desert became a palimpsest, a record of shifting rituals and enduring hopes. Even with these advances, the why remains elusive. Climate studies continue to suggest that cycles of drought and flood played a role. But instead of repeating the old story of spiders for rain and monkeys for fertility, research now paints a subtler picture. The geoglyphs were part of a suite of responses to environmental instability. The Puquio secured groundwater, agricultural terraces made valleys more productive, and the lines, stretching across the plain, bound these practical systems into a cosmological frame. They were not solutions in themselves, but statements, affirmations that survival was not only about engineering, but about harmony with forces larger than human control. This holistic view may be the most important legacy of modern archaeology. The Nazca were not simply artists, nor simply engineers. They were both. Their lives demanded that the two be inseparable. To build aqueducts was also to pray. To carve lines was also to bind communities. The desert itself was both hostile and sacred, a place that required labour and reverence in equal measure. Perhaps the greatest lesson is how much we can learn from technologies the Nazca never imagined. Satellites and drones show us the scale of their vision. Excavations reveal the details of their ceremonies. Climate models place their choices in context. And yet, even with all these tools, the mystery does not vanish. It deepens. Because the closer we look, the more the lines resist being reduced to one purpose. They remain pathways and symbols, calendars and canvases, practical and transcendent all at once. To stand on the Nazca Plain today is to feel that paradox. The desert stretches silent, holding figures carved by hands long gone. Some are crisp, others faint, still others invisible until technology reveals them. Each one is part of a dialogue we can glimpse but never fully enter. The Nazca have left their marks, but the meaning remains theirs, locked in a worldview we can approach only from the outside. Science has made the lines clearer than ever, but clarity does not erase mystery. It only shows us how vast the mystery really is. The desert of Nazca is often described as barren, but its greatest secret is endurance. For nearly 2,000 years, the lines have remained etched into the earth. Elsewhere, shallow grooves just a few inches deep would vanish within a season, erased by rain, softened by wind, or ploughed under by human activity. Here, in one of the driest regions on Earth, the figures linger. The very harshness that made Nazca life precarious became the reason their creation survived. This endurance is not invulnerability. The desert preserves, but it does not protect from us. In the 1920s, vehicles cut careless paths across trapezoids that had lain untouched since antiquity. In 2014, a group of activists climbed onto the plane to unfurl a protest banner near one of the largest figures. Their footprints scarred the fragile surface, leaving marks that may never heal. Even small intrusions, the weight of a tourist's shoes, the tread of a motorcycle, can leave damage lasting centuries. The paradox is painful. The lines survived droughts, winds, and the collapse of civilizations, yet they are vulnerable to a single careless act today. Tourism is both a blessing and a burden. Planes fly visitors over the desert daily, circling so passengers can glimpse the hummingbird's wings or the condor's flight. Towers along the Pan-American Highway allow drivers to stop and peer down at trapezoids and lines. Local communities depend on this flow of travellers. The Nazca Lines have become central to their economy. Yet each expansion, each new road, each unregulated footpath presses against the boundaries of preservation. The desert can shield the lines from time, but not from the hunger of the present. And still, the figures endure, stretching outward in silence as they have for centuries. That endurance invites a deeper question. What do we see when we look at them? For generations, scholars have offered theories, calendars, ceremonial pathways, water rituals, clan symbols. Each theory explains something, yet none explains everything. The truth is likely not one meaning but many, layered over 8 centuries of creation. To imagine that the Nazca had a single, unchanging reason for their geoglyphs is to overlook the span of time involved. The earliest figures were carved around 200 years before Christ. Others were still being made 600 years into the Christian era. Across that long stretch, generations were born, lived, and died. Climate shifted, communities rose and fell, rituals evolved. A hummingbird may have meant one thing in one century and something different in the next. A spiral may have been a fertility symbol at first and later a map of water. Each figure was part of a living tradition, not a frozen code. That layered history complicates our desire for a single explanation. When we ask, why did the Nazca make the lines? We collapse centuries of practice into one answer. But the lines are not a riddle waiting for a single key. They're a chorus of voices, each one singing into the desert, some harmonizing, some contradicting, all preserved in the silence of the plain. Perspective adds another layer to the puzzle. From the ground, the figures are invisible. Walking a trapezoid or the wing of a condor, you see only cleared stones and pale soil. From the air, the shapes leap into clarity. To us, living in the age of flight, the aerial perspective feels natural. But for the Nazca, who never left the earth, the designs were not made for human eyes. They were prayers carved for divine vision. Gods, ancestors, or cosmic forces. Those were the audiences who looked down and saw the whole. The invisibility to humans was not a flaw. It was part of the design. That inversion is haunting. We can now see what they could not. The hummingbird in flight, the monkey's spiral tail, the astronaut's round eyes. But we cannot know what they knew. We can measure their alignments, trace their overlapping lines, model their climate. Yet we cannot enter their prayers. We can see their shapes, but not their meanings. The puzzle of the Nazca is that visibility does not equal understanding. The more we see, the more we realize how much remains hidden. The lines are not only about the Nazca, they're also a mirror for us. Archaeologists see in them a ritual landscape. Engineers see the brilliance of simple surveying. Astronomers see solstice markers. Fringe theorists see runways for alien craft. Tourists see monumental art. Each perspective reveals something, but it also reveals us, our obsessions, our hopes, our need to find meaning in silence. The desert reflects our gaze as much as it reflects the Nazca's hands. Perhaps that is why the alien hypothesis still lingers. For some, it is more satisfying to believe the lines are messages to spacecraft than to accept them as human ritual. For others, the appeal lies in the romance of mystery. And yet, even the outlandish theories testify to the power of the lines. They are so immense, so precise, so enigmatic, that people struggle to believe they could be human. To underestimate the Nazca is to miss the point. The lines endure not because they were alien, but because they were profoundly human. And that, in the end, may be their greatest lesson. The Nazca were not conquerors. They did not build empires of stone like the Inca, nor leave libraries like the Maya. Their villages were small, their tools simple, yet they carved a message large enough to last millennia. They turned a hostile desert into a canvas of hope. They engineered aqueducts that still carry water today, and they engineered rituals that still echo in the silence of their plain. To attribute their work to others is to erase the beauty of human resilience. The lines endure because the human need for meaning endures. They remind us that survival is not enough, that people everywhere, even in the harshest places, seek to leave behind symbols larger than themselves. They remind us that art and ritual can be as essential as food and water, that hope can be carved into the earth as surely as irrigation channels. They remind us that beauty can bloom even in a desert. To stand on the Nazca Plain today is to feel that paradox. The air is hot and dry. The horizon stretches without end. The ground beneath your feet looks ordinary, yet just beyond, a line runs straight into the distance, part of a wing or a spiral or a beak. You cannot see the whole. You can only walk a fragment, knowing that above you, the full figure lies invisible. It is a humbling feeling to be inside a design too large to comprehend, and maybe that is the point. The Nazca carved not for themselves, but for something beyond. Their lines remind us of scale, that human lives are small, but human imagination is vast, that we cannot always see the whole, but we can still participate in it, that what we leave behind may not be understood, but it may still endure. The Nazca Desert holds one of humanity's most enduring puzzles. Straight lines and spirals, condors and monkeys, hummingbirds and spiders, all whispering across centuries. Each figure is a fragment of a dialogue between earth and sky, between humans and the forces they sought to reach. The dialogue is unfinished. The lines are still here, waiting for new eyes, waiting for new interpretations, waiting for us to wonder. And so the desert speaks in silence. Its message is not an answer but a question, one that has lasted nearly 2 millennia and may last for many more. We may never solve the Nazca Lines, but perhaps we are not meant to. Perhaps their gift is that they resist closure, leaving us always looking upward, always asking, always listening.